Welcome back to the Training Model YouTube channel. Today we're going to be discussing joint stability and motor control and these two terms. I've actually just used some of the pre-learning module within the movement mentorship. So I've cut it up a little bit so it's not the full mini lecture for the mentorship, but it's enough to hopefully begin the conversation around sort of these different models that coaches and people in the industry use to understand and describe what is happening within movement and why I hate the term stability and why I think it just confuses both coaches in application of improving hip is one example, but improving a joint's function, quote unquote function, or the expression of movement. And I think if we just zoom out and view what all movement expression is, which is just an expression of motor output as a response to the inputs within the system, as a branch of motor learning and motor control, I think a lot of these very specific, particular muscular first lenses of movement models begin to fall apart very quickly, just simply by removing this idea of stability and just replacing it with this idea of everything's just motor learning and it's a motor expression, a movement expression as a response to the inputs. So if we want to improve the position of the hip, we probably have to change some of the inputs that are coming into the system. So again, this is not the full lecture within the pre-learning modules for the mentorship, but it's a good amount, enough that we can then have some contextual understanding of some of the conversations and discussions that I'll have both on the podcast and here on the YouTube channel. The first intake kicks off on July 3rd. So if you're interested in joining, depending on when you're looking at this video, there's still an opportunity to jump in. Again, you can use the code YouTube to save 15% on either the upfront or the payment plan. The second intake is going to start at the very start of September. I'm going to run 2 this year. I have an idea that I kind of want to build this thing out and have it to become a pretty regular thing that's rolling, because I think that a lot of young coaches and allied health professionals will find these conversations valuable for their own practice. So pretty keen to get this rolling. Again, code YouTube saves 15% if you're keen to jump in. Let me know if you have any questions and drop them down below. And subscribe, please subscribe. Let's get into it. Next up, we're going to unpack joint stability versus motor control and the application of these two ideas. And as I alluded to in the What is a Model video, my view of this conversation is that joint stability is a muscular first lens in understanding why a joint is moving or not moving. That is ultimately when people discuss stability, that's how I view them discussing stability. I think it's a garbage term, and we'll get into why that is, but it's a muscular first term and a muscular first understanding of movement. Versus motor control is zoomed out and understanding that the expression of movement is actually a response of all of the systems that are currently involved in dealing with stimulus and forces and tasks and all of that sort of stuff. Motor control is zoomed out. Stability is muscular first. Let's attack one particular muscle. That's prime example, joint stability, rotator cuff. Rotator cuff is not strong enough. We have to go and do all these silly, dumb exercises. Versus motor control, we need to train the entire system to actually move the arm and decelerate and create force and be reactive and do all of this sort of stuff. Motor control of the particular rotator cuff doesn't fucking matter. It's a global strategy to manage the tasks and the forces and all of that. So starting to see how these things start to unpack. So this is a typical continuum that you will see from people in the industry. And that is that, and again, continuums is the third principle. So we need to understand continuums. But this is a very typical one that we start to see. And it's just founded in a misunderstanding of what the terms mean. At one end, we have a stable or a stability-based idea where we're resisting movement. And at the other end, we have a mobility or a mobile or range of motion-based end of the continuum where we've created movement. And it's people's understanding that these two things are opposite of each other. However, when we start to unpack the definition of these terms and also the application of these terms, They don't make sense. They're not linked. They're not the same thing. So by definition, what is stability? It's the strength to withstand or endure. So the ability for things to disturb us and then we return back to the state that they once were. So the ability to return to equilibrium once disturbed. So there's an external force that causes a change. However, the system is stable enough to then return back to equilibrium. The only place where stability has application in movement is gravity management. And it's going to be a term that we do use in that context, but it's never going to be a term that we use specific to a joint. Because a destabilized system is a system that the center of mass has moved away from the base of support. So if you were to destabilize a human, you drive the center of mass away from the base of support. The human then responds to that change by changing its base of support, moving the leg, maybe grabbing onto something to gain that base of support, so that then the system can then re-stabilize and not fall over. That is the only application of the term stability within actual movement. It is never a stability-based problem at one particular joint. If we wanted to define mobility, it's the ability to freely move. That makes sense. A specific joint may have a mobility restriction. It may lack the ability to freely move in a direction. So that is absolutely one end of this idea of what is going on at a joint. The other side of that continuum that I believe is this idea of stiffness and joint stiffness. And that is the idea that things can become fixed or rigid. So having a mobility problem is actually you've increased, for whatever reason, the stiffness of that area. Whether it's a central nervous system protection-based thing, whether it's a past injury that's caused scar tissue that's limited range of motion, whether or not it's maybe a bone formation change that is blocking a range of motion. These are all things that stiffen up a joint. So if we wanted to put these things on a continuum, it's not mobility and stability, because mobility is to express free movement. Stability is just this ability to return back to equilibrium. So I don't think that's the continuum. That's why it's in red. What is the continuum, if you wanted to place these things on a continuum, is joint mobility at one end and joint stiffness at the other end. And we can actually start to understand what we're talking about here and make practical based strategies around coaching if we identify that mobility or the ability for a joint to move in a direction is the problem. That's the key caveat. So what actually resists movement at a joint? What stops a joint being able to express motion? There's three main categories of things. We have the osseous formation or the bone formation. So the actual type of joint. A shoulder is going to move and express motion completely different to the SI joint or the SIJ, which is the sacrum within the pelvic bowl, just by nature of how they're formed and how evolution has formed those joints. So we can look at the type of joint it is to understand why and how movement is created. The next layer is passive restraints. So passive restraints restrict movement in one direction or in a coupled direction, but they're passive structures. When I say passive, it means that we have no control of them. There is nothing within our central nervous system that we can somatically control and consciously control that creates a restriction in movement here, or that can stiffen up a joint. These are things like ligaments, your meniscus, your labrum. Joint fluid restricts motion if you want to get into fluid dynamics of joints. Adipose tissue, so if you've just got a large amount of fat in one area, maybe the front of your hip, like your belly and your legs and all of that adipose tissue is actually going to start to resist that movement into the direction of hip flexion. That can stop and reduce overall range of motion at the hip. Your skin resists movement. If we were to cut all of your skin off, your joints would be more free. They would access greater ranges of mobility. We also have like vascular and neural pathways. These things are very, very we're talking about like a 0.1%, but anything that crosses a joint, whether it be a vascular, an artery, whether it be like a neural pathway, that is stuff in front of the joint that may stop or resist the motion of that joint itself. But when we discuss passive restraints, so these things that we don't have conscious control over, the main ones that we're going to be talking about are this, which is the ligaments, the meniscus, and the labrums of different joints. Fluid dynamics, if you wanted to get stuck into that more, Bill Hartman's model would be a great place to start. But this is ultimately just how synovial fluid moves and responds within the joint itself. And ultimately, arthritis is an understanding of fluid dynamics altering and changing within the joint, changing the ability for it to show and express movement and mobility. Same with labrum and like up top at like frozen shoulder. So Jared Powell is a fantastic person to look if you want to better understand how the shoulder actually functions. But adaptive capsulitis, I think is what it's called, which is like the actual capsule of the shoulder joint is starting to change its sort of biology and its makeup, and it creates a restriction in movement, and that's ultimately what frozen shoulder is in that direction. So these things, these passive structures all have the ability to resist movement and resist mobility and increase stiffness at a joint. We then have active restraints. So active restraints are things that we consciously can control within our central nervous system, and we can somatically change our strategies around. So this is somatic muscles. So when I say somatic, it's just everything, all the muscles within the body itself. Some muscles are way more of the reflexive, reactive response. We don't have too much control over particular muscles that cross and control intervertebral disc space and the vertebra themselves. However, we can manage and shift tension with our understanding of the skeletal position within those particular muscles. So some muscles like a pec has huge conscious control over it. Other muscles have a more reactive control that we don't have as much conscious control over, but we can influence them by changing skeletal positions. Restraints is the central nervous system and the muscular tension that the central nervous system can create. Before we have conscious control of the muscular system, there is a reflexive response to forces and tasks and inputs into the system, into the central nervous system. So there's reflexes within the muscular system, and then there is conscious somatic muscular tension that we can create and bring things towards us or stretch and do all of that sort of stuff and change our relative bone positions to change muscular tension within the system. Ultimately, this is what motor learning is. Motor learning is the process and the changes in the expression of movement that occur as a response to the sensory inputs that are coming into the system. And over time, with progressive practice, we improve motor outputs. We change the way we move, we strengthen tissues, we get better control. We have this process of practice that begins to adequately load the system so that we can handle more, our capacity increases, and our movement expression becomes more efficient, and we develop the skill that is movement. Ultimately, this is what coaching is. And this is the very crux of the course and this mentorship is understanding how motor learning happens and the process and the strategies that we can do to improve movement outcomes. If we can understand that, we can understand this whole thing. So coaching is progressively challenging different movement expressions towards the goal. So there will be some goal that we're working towards, and we're going to adequately challenge this system so that it can learn to manage forces and manage inputs and create motor outputs. Skill development is motor learning for a controlled movement expression. So skill of a squat is motor learning and coordinated movement within the squat context. And over time, we challenge the system with different tempos and speeds and range of motion and loading strategies and all of that sort of stuff to develop skill. And skill is a formal part of motor learning. It's not the stability of the hip nothing that we're doing within squatting is to improve stability of the hip. It is to zoom out. Again, stability of the hip all of a sudden becomes your glute max is not firing, your adductors are not firing, your fucking external rotators, your deep six are not firing, your hip flexors are taking over. Muscular first, muscular first, muscular first, stability, stability, stability. Zoom the fuck out. How is the system managing the inputs of forces and goals and cues and tempos and all of that? How is the system managing that and expressing movement? To change the movement expression, change all of the inputs or one of the inputs or any of the inputs to change the expression on the other side. And ultimately, this is progression principles of coaching. We have a coaching framework conversation in this chat. But ultimately, that is what we're looking to understand is how can we slide people up and down motor skill continuums in order to challenge them productively and get improved movement expressions. Just a little bit more on motor control. Motor control lives within the sensory motor system. And there's two pathways of inputs that come into the system, or there's two pathways within the system itself. We have afferent pathways, big fancy word that just means there's inputs. Sensory inputs come in. These sensory inputs are received by the central nervous system, so it's feedback into the system. And this feedback into the system and these inputs come from things like pressure, so feeling and sensing pressure, tension within muscles and tissues within the body, temperature. If I touch something hot, I'm receiving temperature-based inputs into the system, which is going to cause a reflexive movement within the system. Sounds can alter what we're doing and what we're sensing, sights and what we're looking at and feeling. And then also finally, we have feeling, just general feeling. Within a coaching standpoint, this is typically termed proprioception. So proprioception is just an understanding of where your body is in space. Sometimes we get external proprioceptive feedback like touching things and feeling things. That's really important. Other times it's the actual relative positions of the joints themselves. Your brain, your central nervous system has receivers within the joints that tell the body where it is in space. And when things start to move in a direction or too quickly in one direction or one continuum, the body knows because of all of that sensation and begins a reflexive response to make sure we no longer travel in that direction. So that is all of our sensory inputs. The crux of it is proprioception. It's feeling. When we talk about coaching application, it's going to be feelings. We then have our second pathway, which is efferent pathways, which is the outputs of the motor system. So the muscles and the central nervous system creating movement as a response to the inputs. These are first the reflexes within the system. And then secondary, it's the somatic muscular tension that is controlled and consciously controlled by us. So we have reflexes first and then additional muscular tension. And that is principle 2 of my model. Muscle tension is reactive to the relative positional changes of the skeleton first. All secondary tension is laid on top of that reactive strategy to manage gravity. And now we're starting to see how this model starts to play out. So motor control is what we need to understand. Muscular tension, this is bringing back some of the stuff that we've already chatted about, but muscular tension and conscious muscular tension within training is, let's step back. Muscular tension is first subconscious. It's a reactive output from the sensory inputs and the information that the body is receiving. It happens way faster than we could ever consciously control, and we'd fuck ourselves up if we had full conscious control. Evolution has made that all a reactive process that happens beneath the surface of our consciousness. Then consciously controlled motor outputs are laid on top of the reactive stuff, the reflexive stuff, in order to perform the tasks that we create and place in front of our clients. So that is just that same thing, that it's reactive first and then it's conscious. Beneath the observed movement that you're looking at is a reactive muscular tension managing all of the sensory inputs. The key word that we need to understand, or the key principle that we need to understand, is that most of the sensory inputs are coming from how we're managing gravity and the relative bone positions and joint positions that we're in order to manage gravity first. Secondary to that is an understanding of center of mass and base of support. And we're going to unpack that in detail throughout this course. But if we can understand where center of mass is and where it's moving and the direction and the speed that it's moving, and relative to the base of support, how far and how much it has left to go, we can very quickly start to see what is the reactive process of gravity management within the system and within the muscles, and we can very quickly start to change it and improve movement expression towards our end goals and our end tasks. So stability is a muscular first lens term. It makes no sense in the general discussion of a systemic view of what is going on. If we replace the term stability with control, most coaching, in fact, every coaching decision becomes easier to manage from a movement context. Motor control development is a logical program progression. There's a process that we can do to improve motor control. There is endless years of study, of skill development within whatever context you want. There's a very particular framework that we can learn to develop motor control and motor learning and challenge and let failure happen. And then the system begins to respond and change the way it expresses movement. All of that stuff is founded in motor learning and motor control. Stability is confusing. We zoom into the hip and try to understand hip stability. All of a sudden, we start discussing particular muscles and timings of muscles and all of this sort of shit. In reality, none of that matters. It's a global, zoomed out strategy of management of sensory inputs and seeing motor outputs and changing the inputs in order to change those outputs of a motor perspective. So that was a big one. Hopefully, we're starting to see this model unpack, and we'll move into the next one, which is the beginning of joint space continuum. Thanks for making it to the end here. If you have any questions, drop them down below. I'm here to help. Again, you can use code YouTube to save 15% on the movement mentorship. The first intake kicks off on July the 3rd, so not too late to get involved if you're keen. So hopefully we'll see you there. Please subscribe. Follow me on Instagram and ask me any questions if you need help understanding these concepts.